Hello class, welcome back. This week we're going to be doing chapter 15, Christianity and the Formation of Europe. This will be week 3. So what am I talking about? What does this title slide even mean? Christianity and the Formation of Europe. Well, we want to start with the people who gave Christianity a boost. Yes, we know that state-sanctioned persecution was happening of Christians in Rome for failure to worship Rome's pantheon of gods, including emperors as gods. But what a lot of people don't know is that uh, in 312 AD, Roman Emperor Constantine issues a tolerance decree for all religions. Now, this is not just for Christianity, but Christianity falls under this. And so, in this way, Christianity was quote unquote legalized throughout the Roman Empire, which was a pretty big deal considering that Constantine himself was a patron after he allegedly witnessed a vision of a cross during a battle in 312 AD. Who was Constantine, and what did he leave behind? Well, one of his most important contributions to Roman history was his arch. Now, triumph arches would be things that Roman emperors would have built after they had a successful military campaign, conquered someone, did a good public service, and they would have a parade that would go through all of Rome and walk underneath this arch that was built. Now, taking a look at this, we can see that it is relief sculptures. Relief sculptures, remember, are coming out of the stone. The attic is just like what you think it is. It's the very, very top of the structure, and it has a long inscription. Um, Constantine's victory solidified him as an emperor, but just to pay homage to the history of Rome, there are previous emperors' battles depicted on this arch as well. It was erected next to the Colosseum as kind of a show of strength, and as we'll see when we look at this next slide with a close-up of the arch, narrative clarity is more important than realism here, let's say. We can clearly tell that these are people, but the uniformity of them, their lack of individual detail, considered last week when we talked about the evolution of Greek statues and how beautiful and meticulously crafted those were. One might think, well, what happened? What happened was a whole lot of stuff, and the only way to tell it was um, more tell than show. Early Christianity was in fact more of a cult than a true religion, at least as we understand it today. Much of the early Christian worship and gathering took place secretively in private homes, caves, underground. They've even discovered a home church completely intact. And take a look at this sarcophagus. Now, this would have been a Roman sarcophagus, but it has depictions of scenes from the Bible. We can clearly see Adam and Eve and the tree of wisdom and the snake down here. We can see some other things too. So take a quick moment to just take a look at this, and if you are familiar with Bible history, see if you recognize any of these scenes. Going next into Christian architecture, this was something the Christian religion revolutionized architecture pretty much forever. Um, so Emperor Constantine was creating lots of churches. The biggest church that was created during this time period was St. Peter's Basilica in the mid 4th century. Christian worship, funnily enough, focused on the congregation itself, the people. So the basilica style was adapted to fit large groups of worshippers. They would basically take it and completely stretch it out. Now, looking at Old St. Peter's, we see some traditional Christian architectural archetypes being used here. The transept and the nave up at the top go through each other, so that creates a cross, the most fundamental Christian symbol. Now the apse up at the very, very tippy top is the focal point of worship, so it all leads up to that. And we have some features of Roman architecture, and some of these things are still in churches today. And you go into a church, there's usually kind of an atrium, kind of a courtyard, waiting area. This is a very Roman design aspect. So, what else was the Roman Empire doing? How else was the Roman Empire sponsoring Christianity? Well, in 324 AD, Emperor Constantine ordered the tiny little Greek colony of Byzantio to be transformed into a new capital city from which he could rule the entire empire, and he moved everything over in 330 AD. Though greatly diminished by the time the Ottomans took over, the title of the Byzantine emperor was always Emperor of all Romans, and they saw themselves as such. They saw themselves as being ahead of Rome in the West. The Byzantines made Christianity a state religion. This left church and state to heavily, heavily intertwine. Eventually, in the 6th century, the imperial court was moved to Ravenna, Italy, and this would create some shockwaves because it introduced the Italians. Um, they were not the Italians at this point. They were still somewhat the Romans, but it somewhat brought the court back to real Rome. Um, this church of San Vital used a central plan like the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople. Um, Once again, the goal is not realness, but symbolism. If you take a look, we can see highly symbolistic artwork, hierarchy of order, which we'll talk about later. The idea of informational church art was a major proponent of Byzantine Christianity, and it carried over into the Middle Ages. Byzantine icons, one of my favorite things. This is coming from the Greek word icon, which means image. And an icon was a portrait of a sacred person or portrayal of a sacred event, most commonly painted on gilded wood panels in tempera. The Christ Pantocrator image here on the left, this is one of the oldest types of iconographic styles that there is. This particular Christ Pantocrator is from Mount Sinai, one of the oldest continuously operated monasteries. So he's making a blessing with his hand, holds his gospel in the other, but I want you to pay attention to the face of Christ here. Notice his right side is a little bit more haggard, a little bit more droopy. His left side is free of imperfections. This is to denote the duality, the dual nature of Christ, half man, half perfect. Oops. Um, and I want to real quickly revisit the iconoclastic period. Um, we have other iconoclastic periods throughout history, but this is kind of the OG iconoclastic period, as it were. And so we all remember the commandment in the Hebrew Bible, right? No idols, no idolatry, which is what some people were viewing these icons as. So, despite being a point of contact with the sacred, they are also believed to have been divinely created. In the 8th and 9th centuries, the church banned these images. Lots of art was taken and honestly destroyed before being resolved. In the mid 9th century, we have Empress Irene mostly to thank for that. The logic behind allowing images again was that, well, they're stand-ins for these people, but they're not really them, so we're technically not worshiping any one false. Another example of the Christ Pantocrator, um, they made him so big to fearmonger just a little bit, and this is a good example in this church, which I believe is the Hagia Sophia of hierarchy of order. So we notice the church fathers down below and various saints flanking Jesus. Jesus is at the top, so he's obviously the most important. He's also the biggest. But notice that we also have Mary in the center of everything, um, which definitely means something. In the Eastern Orthodox Church, Mary was in a more highly elevated position than she ends up being here in the West. So Byzantium in the East, Rome in the West. Eventually, they just decided to partition the empire. The West fell first, lost its imperial power due to immigration, taxation problems, plagues. That's a whole nother story, though. There's actually a really good book about the subject, The Fate of Rome, written by an old professor of mine, Kyle Harper, if you're interested in finding out why exactly the Roman Empire in the West fell. But the Western Church eventually becomes Catholic. And so while the seat is in Rome with the Vatican, the true power had been spread throughout to local European leaders. This was a problem for the Eastern Church in Constantinople because they could not claim hegemony with this. And so we move into the European Middle Ages. The Middle Ages is a name usually given for the period between the last Roman emperor of Rome in the 400s AD and the start of the Renaissance in the 1500s AD. It was initially viewed as kind of just a crappy period of history, but now we know that it's far more complex. Germanic people and Scandinavian people emerged, Northern Europeans caused the collapse of Rome. Um, they were referred to as barbarians by the Romans due to how the Romans perceived their language to sound as bar, bar, bar. Um, this is just some good old fashioned shit talking by the Romans. So by 600 AD, what is now modern Europe had begun to form as we know it and mostly converted to Christianity. The Isle of Britannia, we have the Roman settlement of Londinium eventually becoming London, um, and we have an important East Anglian grave of a king in the Isle of Britannia, the Sutton Hoo site. Now, there was already a thriving culture and civilization on the island of Britannia by the time the Romans showed up, I believe, under Hadrian. So by this time, there had been several expeditions. By the 7th century, there had been several expeditions. But I want you to pay attention to the patterns of, I believe this is a sword buckle. Um, or no, sorry, a belt buckle. But the intricate kind of weaving patterns on here, almost snake-like. We would call this animal style. And I want you to pay attention to this and see on the next slide the development as we talk about scriptures and illuminated manuscripts. So, first of all, um, an illuminated manuscript in a book is a book. A book used to be copied only by hand, carried out only in monasteries, only by monks, only by the Roman Catholic Church. So, for the longest time, the Catholics had a, oh, what do you call it? Monopoly on books, which sounds crazy to think about in this day and age. Um, but there was a whole lot that had to be done to create a book, and so inconsistencies began to happen. Something that was copied over and over and over and over again was bound to have some mistakes. But I want you to take a look at Chi Rho here, the first letters of Christ in Greek, and I want you to take a look back at this belt buckle, and I believe that there's some similarity in the interweaving and flowing type of design. Up to you. Okay, Carolingian style is something that we could easily get trapped in pretty much forever. It's a lot of people's favorite subject matter because you can do a lot with it, you can guess a lot of things about it, make some big assumptions. So what does Carolingian style even mean? Um, it's named after Emperor Charlemagne, who is a powerful Frankish king, basically a German, and he basically kicked everybody's ass in Western Europe, and the Pope knew he was kind of a famous badass, and so he said, please, please help us with some invaders of Rome. And he came and helped, and that's where the title Holy Roman Emperor comes from. Um, yes, the Holy Roman Empire was not Roman, but it was somewhat an empire. That phraseology always bothers me because there is much to talk about with the Holy Roman Empire. It's just hard for the layman to understand without a baseline of knowledge. So Charlemagne built his capital city in Aachen, Germany, and boy did he take all of the most holy of relics possible from Rome and Ravenna and all over the world for his palace. Now, if we take a look at the picture of the palace here, we can see its heavy inspiration by San Vitale in Ravenna due to not only its shape but the instructional religious art. So the High Middle Ages, we can divide the Middle Ages up into two eras. 1050 to 1200, this is our Romanesque period, and 1200 to 1400, Gothic era, which started in northern France. Romanesque, named so because, surprise, the architectural style was borrowing from and heavily similar to Roman architecture. And a driving force behind all of these new churches, new buildings being put up was that people were going on religious pilgrimages because it was safe to travel. The 11th and 12th centuries were relatively prosperous and safe times in human history. Um, so people got out, people were moving about. Um, Lodgings and churches around Europe became stopovers for religious pilgrims. It could be a church, it could be someone's house, it could be a famous inn, but the pilgrimages were starting. And why were these pilgrimages becoming more popular? Well, we start to get relics of saints in a lot of places. Yes, in the Church of Santa Foy, we have a good example. We have the relics of Saint Foy, a little girl who was put to death in the 3rd century for refusing to worship pagan gods. Pieces of her body, her skull, were collected and kept as a focal point of veneration. And this would be common all over the place. It's kind of fun to look up Google image search medieval saints because some of the presentation aspects with it is just totally nuts. Jewel encrusted skeletons behind a thick case of glass. They keep some of this stuff more secure than arguably more important things. Here we have Christ presenting the keys to St. Peter and the law to St. Paul, another example of some church art. And this is, of course, directly inspired by the scripture, Thou art Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and I will give unto thee the keys of the kingdom of heaven. And so here he is with the key. He is offering keys and laws made of ivory. And recall, Peter was allegedly the first designated pope, and keys today still remain a large part of papal iconography. One other thing to note about this is the Romanesque style of figures, which were generally very elongated. So let's talk about the Goths now. Let's talk about the Gothic period, actually. We won't talk much about the Goths. The Goths were a real people, one of the nomadic tribes sweeping through Europe in the 4th and 5th centuries, but the style was started by a French fellow named Abbot Sugar, who wanted to remodel and, let's say, embiggen his church of Saint Denis, which is near Paris. He believed churches should reach up to heaven, have harmonious proportions, and be filled with light. So he does this with two kind of trademarks of the Gothic style in churches. He builds the Chartres Cathedral in France with extremely pointy um, arches, and then he introduces us to stained glass, and we'll look at both of these things in the upcoming slides. So Chartres Cathedral has all the characteristics of Gothic architecture, and I want you to look at the left spire and the spire to the right of it. This is a good evolution of Gothic style example. The left tower is obviously older, and the right tower is newer. It gets even skinnier, even pointier, even more ornate. And a vocabulary word for you all is the word flamboyant, flamboyant. It's French for flame-like, and it was to describe the pointed arches of these churches. Sculpture in the Middle Ages, Chartres Cathedral is another excellent example because we have over 2,000 figures decorating the cathedral, especially around the entrances. And we can see progression of skill through the ages here as well. Go from left to right. Look how much feet are shown. We eventually get to the point where we see legs, ankles, but here they're almost floating. Um, St. Theodore on the far left even is turning his head a little bit, seemingly more alive than his brethren on the right. And of course, stained glass. Um, there are over 150 stained glass windows in Chartres with a variety of motifs from the Bible, the lives of the saints, the zodiac, and all kinds of people. This is the famous rose window due to its circular nature, dedicated to Queen Mary, or to Mary, Mother of God, seen as the Queen of Heaven here. Notice she is right there, enthroned, holding all of the objects of power. Goes kind of back to talking about Mary being a warrior queen, a powerful figure who is not just a mom in the Eastern Church. The Middle Ages weren't all just religious art, however. Um, Private art was owned for devotionary purposes or just to cover up the walls. Lots of medieval castles would have had tapestries covering up bare wall space. There would not have been much bare wall being shown. Um, the aquamaniles, from aqua, water, and manus, hands, were basically like little hand washing devices, either used by a priest or somebody who is very, very rich. Originating in Persia, which is modern day Iran, they're shaped like lions, which, go figure, were popular with the Christians. A little bonus, last last spring, I was in New York City and made it to the Metropolitan Museum of Art Cloisters, and I got to see the unicorn tapestry in all its glory. So just kind of a fun art history nerd moment. Touching base again on illuminated manuscripts real quick. Uh, Illuminated manuscripts were only found in wealthy homes, so that's rulers, merchants, but they didn't always present religious themes. They presented secular themes as well. Um, Great Chronicles of France shows the lineage of kings from ancient Troy to the 15th century. So that's a long time. This one depicts a knight named Roland who was unfortunately slain in battle by the Muslims, and so he's being taken up to heaven. Um, for a few laughs, you can Google Roland the Farter, who's another famous Roland of history. And these final few slides, we're going to take a look at some pre-Renaissance type art. Gothic style eventually gave way to Italian art, but this Italian art was imported. Recall all of the plundering that was going on and the power, the rising power of places like Venice. Um, and so you get these artists that in Italy are influenced by stuff from the Byzantines. Duccio made the Nativity here with the prophets Isaiah and Ezekiel, part of a larger altarpiece for the Siena Cathedral, and we can see the clear Byzantine influence from the golden halos, the gold background, hierarchy of scale with Mary in the middle. There's a slight level of three-dimensionality here, but not a ton. Whereas if we go to Giotto, Giotto is using decorative bands to create three registers on the walls of the Scrivani Chapel in Padua here. He divides it up so that he can create multiple scenes between the registers. This is, of course, Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead. But look at this composition. It's almost as if it's a play, right? On a stage. Characters are very full-bodied, three-dimensional. Sense of depth is present if we look at that tree back there. And so this is Giotto brings us more into what the true Italian style was going to come to be known as. A little bit about Italian propaganda and the Crusades. This is what I wrote a majority of my master's thesis over. For the Fourth Crusade, Western European forces from Venice, England, all over, looted and pillaged Constantinople, the Byzantine capital, taking with them untold amounts of saints, relics, icons, art, and more. They took pieces of the true cross, all kinds of stuff. And there is an intense historical revisionism debate at hand with scholars who want to defend the Renaissance as a spontaneous Italian era of ideas with no inspiration or precedent from anything else. This is something I discovered a lot in my research for my master's thesis was multiple published authors of scholarly monocles, aka super nerdy books, research uh, level books. Many of these authors were completely ignoring any influence that Byzantine art would have had on artists such as those we just looked at, like Duccio and Giotto. And it was kind of mind-blowing to me. The Italian Renaissance is largely a part of the crumbling of the Byzantine Empire and its impact and influence on Italian art. Going all the way back to the beginning of our lecture, recall Ravenna was the capital of the Byzantine Empire briefly, located in Italy. The city of Venice even saw themselves as the spiritual successors to Constantinople, so they stole their most famous icon and adopted Mary as their saint of the city. So the point I want to make here is that the Italian Renaissance was not spontaneous. It was built on the back of looting, pillaging, plundering, and we can appreciate the ramifications that it had for Western humanities, but to broaden our own personal historiographical timelines a little bit is never a bad thing either. So that's all I've got for this week. Next week, you guessed it, we'll be moving into the Italian Renaissance. Stay tuned.